So welcome, to the Citizen Network North America. This today is really a review. I've put together some work from citizen-centered leadership development based on our mission here at Citizen Network North America of inclusion, the idea of inclusion as really being active and experience. It's a verb, not a program and not a service. And really kind of just, I'm just driven to this by the notion that, we think, especially here in the United States, that we are doing a really great job supporting inclusion for people with significant intellectual, developmental, and other disabilities, as well as other marginalized people. But the reality of it is that it's become something very, very programmatic. And, much of our members in society leave the work of including people to the professionals. And I'm curious by that. So I put together this small, the small micro learning segment to see, it's try to organize my thinking about like what happens, how does this happen? And what might we do that looks different, maybe, so ending with a few questions. So I call that Reflections on Dimensions of Citizenship and Social Perception of Disability as Barriers to Inclusion. And I'm drawing heavily from the work of a man named John O'Brien. For those of you who don't know John, John is a leading thinker who has written widely in the field of disability. He's a pioneer and lifelong advocate of something we call person-centered planning. And his values-based approach emphasizes the learning with each person about the directions their lives could take, challenging and overcoming practice, structures, and values that lead to segregation and the underestimation rather than inclusion. And so his work has influenced people all over the world, in building a world where everyone belongs. He is a primary contributor to the course Citizen-Centered Leadership, which is a video-based learning experience. And I'm drawing from that work here, used with permission from Citizen-Centered Leadership. And I'm real proud to be able to share the following excerpts. There are 3 very short clips followed by maybe a brief summation. But as you listen, think about your own experience, your own witness to what the inclusion of marginalized people look like and feel like, either from your place of work, your efforts, or as a member of society. And again, my premise is we talk about here in the States how we do remarkable work around the idea of the inclusion of people with disabilities into typical life, into everyday communities. But quite frankly, it falls short of the mark. And so let's listen to John kind of talk about this. And this is John talking about using citizen as a framework for inclusion. And so just to kind of set that framework, here he is.
Citizenship matters a lot for people who are vulnerable to social exclusion because it creates a framework for understanding what it is that we're really trying to do. The sort of classic idea is that there are 3 dimensions of citizenship: legal, political, and social. And starting in the early middle 1960s, the legal benefits of citizenship began to come to people with significant disabilities as we kind of recoiled from the terrible conditions that people were in institutions. And the political dimension of citizenship has been a bit slower to come, but has the idea that people need to be actively engaged in the decision-making in their communities and in their lives. And the social dimension of citizenship has suggested since Aristotle's time, that there's no way for a community to be healthy if its people aren't actively engaged in organizing themselves, actively engaged in defining the kinds of issues that will make for progress, and actively engaged in working for those things. And all three of those dimensions of citizenship are contested. So there's no book to look in to say what the right answer is. We have conflict about it. And so citizenship is the space of freedom, and we keep struggling to understand what freedom means in the presence of difference, and in particular in the presence of dependency, in the presence of requiring extra help to make it through your day or make it through your week. Another way to think about citizenship is to say that it's people saying, I belong to this place and to these people, and I'm willing to act from responsibility for that belonging.
So some of the summary points are, the legal dimension transpired as America recoiled from the conditions experienced by people with significant disabilities. And he's referencing institutionalization, the warehousing of people with significant disabilities. The political dimension of citizenship has the idea that people need to be actively engaged in the decision-making in their communities and in their lives. And the social dimension suggests that there's no way for a community to be healthy if its people aren't actively engaged in organizing themselves, in defining the kinds of issues that will make progress, and actively engaged in working for those things. Citizenship is the space of freedom, and we keep struggling to understand what freedom means in the presence of difference, and in particular in the presence of dependency and the presence of requiring extra help to make it through the day or the week. Another way to think about citizenship, it's people saying, I belong to this place and to these people, and I'm willing to act from responsibility for that belonging. And that's part of the dilemma that I'm always, struggling with is I believe people who are carers, people who support individuals, who are marginalized, act from this place on behalf of and with people with disabilities, but the other side of the equation is missing, and that the general public might not be holding this sensibility or this ideal the way that people who feel people in paid roles feel responsible to it. So here's the next video from John, and it's on just, again, they're brief. It's on the evolution, what he describes as the evolution of citizenship.
Well, historically, people haven't been good at seeing citizenship in an inclusive way. So Aristotle in the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics wrote about citizenship, but he only meant free Athenian men. There were no way that women could be citizens. There was certainly no way that slaves could be citizens. When we created the United States Constitution, we defined people, African American people, as 3/5 of a person. We counted them for the purpose of political representation, but women didn't get the right to vote until the 1920s, and African American people continued to have trouble with the political dimension of citizenship all the way up through the 60s and into the early 70s. People with disabilities are just beginning. In some ways, people with significant disabilities are just beginning to have the assistance that they require in a form that permits them to enact their citizenship, that gives them that choice and also that duty. And one of the areas of growth that I see is that people have a set of legal rights that have been established and a set of entitlements that have been established by policy, but we've way underdeveloped. The political dimension of citizenship and the social dimension of citizenship lags even more. So people with disabilities are kind of part of the process of trying to understand who really belongs, who really is one of us as opposed to one of them. So the relationship between citizenship and disability is a relationship of tension, and it'll be a productive tension to the degree that we can figure out how to hold it in the everyday interactions that we have with each other.
So again, to summarize, John said, oops, my bad. John says, I'm so sorry. Historically, people have not been good at seeing citizenship in an inclusive way. People with disabilities are just beginning to have the assistance they require in a form that allows them the choice and the duty to enact their citizenship. And the political dimension of citizenship, and by extension, the experience of inclusion and belonging for marginalized people, is underdeveloped, and the social dimension lags even further behind. And so this last video clip, which is a bit longer than the others, just by a couple of minutes, the question that was posed to John in this series was, why? What did he think? What is the social perception about disability? And so this is an excerpt from that interview and his response.
When non-disabled people have even quite significantly disabled coworkers, they often leave the category of disability intact and exempt the person that they've come to know. So people will say things to me sometimes like, Anna, who doesn't speak, who requires large amounts of systematic instruction to learn something new, Anna's not disabled at all, because their picture of disability doesn't match Anna. And instead of the dissonance challenging the category and saying, well, that was a pretty stupid category, there's a surprising number of people who preserve the category for other people that they don't know and take the person that they do know out of it. I don't think that's inevitable. I don't think that's universal, but it's a sign to me of how far we have to go. So I'm not a very optimistic person, and I have been astonished repeatedly at how far people with disabilities have been able to come through their own desire and through their capacity to recruit allies into their lives. So I would say that we're farther along the way to people with disabilities being part of ordinary life in positive ways. But I think that it is also true that, for example, in this country these days, we terminate about 80% of the pregnancies where Down syndrome is detected. And that doesn't sound to me like a ringing endorsement of disability becoming a kind of a mainstream or a popular reality. And that's given that we've got people with Down syndrome who have been on, in TV shows and who show up in all kinds of wonderful ways. So with all that achievement, we've still got people saying, I'd rather be dead than be like that person, or people saying, if there's disability in my family's life, there's something to be ashamed of, or there's something tragic. And people with disabilities have, not as a class of people, but many people with disabilities have been resilient to that, have staked out their lives and pushed back at that. But what needs pushing back at is quite complex, I think. And so I can't ever imagine a sort of single path or even, kind of multiple strategies. It seems to me that it's all about each of us in the place that we're given to work or given to live or contribute. It's about us saying, well, what are we going to do to recognize the capacities that people have and to expect positive contribution to open up valued roles and to accord people dignity. The dignity of expecting that they're going to, find something that matters to them and that's good for all of us in some fashion, whatever fashion makes sense for that person. So I think my imagination isn't big enough to imagine some great lever to pull. It seems to me that it's going to be tens of thousands of small acts, and every once in a while it may be punctuated by big and unpredictable shifts. So I don't see us right now in a terribly favorable position, but that could change. I think, there's lots of things that scare us and lots of things that make us think that we're in a position of scarcity, and people with disabilities look like kind of a luxury item, look like kind of an extra expense, that's been true in other times, most recently in the eugenic times in the last century, and hasn't gone all that well for people with significant disabilities. So I think it's a very worthy notion, and I think each of us has got to figure out, so what can I do to increase the probability that good things will happen for people with disabilities, and it'll be less of a big deal, and people won't have as much to lift if they find themselves in that circumstance. But we've got lots of things that we just haven't learned yet. We haven't figured it out. We thought we had a pretty good head start on inclusive schooling, and that kind of got turned around and turned into a professional product that becomes largely a process of exclusion or separation as it's actually carried out. So we move forward, and then we, kind of slide back, and our greatest responsibility from my point of view is just to keep learning and to stick with people as things get better and when things get worse. We're beginning to see people who were liberated from institutional life who are facing going back as they get into their 50s and all the medical neglect begins to catch up with them. And our system says, well, back to the nursing home with you because some other budget will pay for that. So we got a good ways to go before. Again, I think, mild disability is more acceptable and so forth than ever, and I think that's fantastic. I think that's wonderful. But people who require more assistance, not so easy for me to see.
So some of the key points, and I may have missed a couple, but non-disabled people who are in relationship with someone with a disability, even someone with a significant disability, will leave the category of disability intact and exempt the person they've come to know. Their knowing the person shifts how they see them. They don't belong in that category, creating a dissonance whereby their picture of disability doesn't match the person. Instead of the dissidents challenging the category gets preserved for other people they don't know and take the person that they do know out of it. Although we are farther along the way of people with disabilities being part of ordinary life in positive ways, it's also true that in the United States, disability is not a mainstream popular reality. Despite having strong examples and role models of people with disabilities making significant contributions. In times when we believe we're in a position of scarcity, people with disabilities look like they are an expense, a drain on our resources. And seemingly good ideas for inclusion get turned around and become professional products that tend to lead to exclusion. So I, as I was thinking about today, and as I was thinking about all of these things that John raises, and I've long wondered, what is it that we as professionals keep applying the same technologies and ideologies to creating, opportunities for inclusion for people, but fall short of it. And then in my studies, just the other day, I was introduced to this idea of Overton's window. And the Overton window is really a model that is used to understand how political decisions get made. And I couldn't help but think, because John just got, is referencing the political dimensions, he's referencing social dimensions, and, really talking about, in that evolution, the context, that politics plays. And despite the fact that there are laws in place in the United States, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, which aims to give individuals with disabilities full rights and equitable access to every aspect of life that people without disabilities have, the ideal of inclusion falls short of its mark for many people living with significant disabilities. So the window, Overton window, is a model for understanding how ideas in society change over time and influence policies. The core concept is that politicians are limited in the policy ideas that they can support, right? Their time and their energy. Generally only pursuing policies that are widely accepted throughout society as legitimate policy options. And what's interesting is John mentioned in the evolution, and he mentioned in the beginning, that deinstitutionalization in the United States happened because, people recoiled from what they learned, what they saw about institutional life. And so that was a political decision started, right? In the Kennedy era. And so politics does play a role in it. And it led to the Americans with Disabilities Act to be enacted and then reenacted, right? So it's what's interesting though is John has also said that, the idea of inclusion and personal responsibility for creating the conditions for inclusion isn't widely accepted. It's not a mainstream concept. So to me, that's the interesting part. That's the point of intersection. So I wanted to just share at least the Overton window, and then ask a couple of questions and leave you with a couple of questions, I guess. So there are these dimensions, there are these phases of decision making that happen. And ideas move through them, ideals and ideas move through them. And the first is unthinkable, like a concept or an idea is brought to someone and it's out of the realm of possibility, right? It's identified as unthinkable. And so that, what by definition in the Overton window model, it says that it lacks significant support or a true rationale in public opinion. The next phase of decision making, and in my opinion, like then active engagement or involvement, is radical. One time, in our last session, we talked about radical disability, right? The radical phase is when a decision or position that would be accepted by a small minority of the population due to existing dissidents. Right. So there's a small group that just says we don't agree and we're going to say something, we're going to do something about it. Then there's the acceptable phase of decision making, right? And that's the idea that of radical change developing a strong enough foothold in the current discourse to be considered legitimate, right? Like somewhere along the line, that radical decision making, kind of finds its way in. Prohibition was an example that they used. Also, the war on drugs here in the United States was an example where, you watch something go from unthinkable to suddenly becoming acceptable. And it's in this space of acceptability that change will happen, that shift will start to happen, because the next phase is considered sensible. And that's where the average member of society understands the pros and the cons of a policy and decides that there are more benefits than consequences, right? So again, deinstitutionalization moved in this place, and then from sensible, it becomes popular. And this is the phase in which the public political discourse has earned traction on a legislative scale. So there's laws or there's rules in place, which also then become a political possibility implemented into law. So it's now everyone is talking about it. The mainstream is talking about it. And so we'll actually do something about it. We'll enact it. And then, of course, it moves into its policy phase where it comes, through the appropriate legislative chambers and becomes law. So the ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act, went through all of this, and it began with institutionalization. So if this makes some sense, the dilemma of inclusion, when I've been thinking about that model is, so in the United States, inclusion, with quotes, has become the job of disability care providers and service workers. There are programs designed to provide inclusion activities to people with disabilities. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are ideals that appear best for the overall society, but do not yet seem to fit the requirements of the current window of acceptable ideas to most of the general public. I mean, so the language is there, but not the behaviors. So the question that I am left with, or the questions, and that, I'd like to be able to kind of get a sense from you all if they make sense, if the model fits the questions, and the questions are, I think, provocative enough to help us to think differently, to think in other ways about how we might shift social perception. So, so the question is that although the Overton window is a model most used in understanding and explaining political decision-making and action, is it possible it can also be applied to exploring and understanding why the experience of full inclusion for people with disabilities and other marginalized communities is stalled? So that's my first question, right? And the second one is, can the model then offer insight into what needs to happen to shift public opinion and subsequently their active investment in building diverse and inclusive communities? And so I'm just kind of like wondering if we can have a conversation about what we've just listened to and learned. And I'm particularly interested, in your opinions around, what John had to say across those three segments, those key takeaway points, and if the Overton model is useful for us to think about what are the practices that fall into different levels of the Overton model, and is it useful to us in thinking about things we might want to try that can shift then social perception, the popularity of other people beyond the disability community, disability service world, being invested in and promoting the full inclusion of people who are marginalized. So, and then I've left y'all with a bunch of John's writings.